The histogram in Lightroom Classic is one of the most important tools that you have, and learning how to use it is really going to help guide you in shaping the image into the way that your mind's eye saw it. Today we're going to talk about using the basic panel to edit your images and using that histogram as the guide. We've got a lot to do, so let's get right to it. Before we get started though, did you know that in real life you and I could actually work together to improve your photography? Whether that be remotely from the comfort of your own living room, joining me around the world at any of the amazing destinations that I lead small group workshops, or even creating your own one-on-one like we're doing here. Light Source Journeys, helping illuminate your photographic journey. For more information, check out the description below. Now let's get to it. You may have noticed that I'm not in my normal surroundings right now. I'm currently down in Mexico City putting the finishing touches on a small group workshop that I'm going to be hosting down here next year. If we get a little bit of background noise, that's what you're hearing. This is a pretty quiet area within Mexico City, but you never know what kind of trucks are going to be beeping in the background. Today, we're going to be talking about getting into the histogram in Lightroom, how it's actually trying to give you an indication of the way the light is reading across your photo, and how you can best use that while you're editing. We're also going to talk about the basic panel. That's the start of your editing in Lightroom Classic, and it's really where you're starting to shape the way that your mind's eye saw that image. As we get into this right now, I'm going to open up my Develop module. Here we can see we've got a standard landscape with nothing too bright or nothing really too dark in the image, and because of that, the histogram is actually fairly even all the way across. Now you can see there's some peaks and some valleys within this area here. If the histogram is representing dark to lights within the image, the left side are your blacks, the right side are your whites. Now the best way I've heard a histogram described is probably by Julianne Cost. She's the woman that does the Lightroom Classic tutorials for Adobe itself, and she's described them as if you were to take each pixel in your image and think of it as a tile in a mosaic. You take the black tiles and you stack them over on the left side. The more black tiles, the higher that stack's going to rise. So as you look at those peaks and valleys, that means within that grayscale area, there's more pixels that fall in that range. If I actually hover my cursor over my histogram, I can see that in the center here, it's showing me the exposure area. And if you look in the basic slider down here, there's also exposure. And it's currently a little brighter than the others, showing me that that's the area that would be affected if I was to move this slider. Moving to the right, I've got my highlights. Even more to the right, we have our whites. Those are the brightest pixels within the image. And then on the other side of our exposure, we've got our shadow area and then our blacks. Now in this histogram, we can see that the shadows have a pretty heavy amount of detail within them, and also this exposure area and bleeding into the highlight area. Those sliders are going to have the most effect on this image if we were to move them. Now not only can we move the sliders to change the bright to dark value within this image, but we could also go, and if I have my cursor over my histogram, I could actually slide as I'm pushing down on my mouse or my control pad, and we can see the same adjustment in now that exposure area. If I go to the shadows, push and hold, and then move, I'm adjusting now my shadow area. Now I didn't want to do either of those adjustments. I like the way this image looks, so I'm just going to go back before those. And we're going to go and look at an image that's maybe a little less typical for that standard range. This is known as a high key image. A high key image skews to the brighter side. We can see because of that, the histogram is showing that there's way more in that bright, those whites. You see this huge stack of pixels over in the whites area. We've got some pretty good pixel areas covered in these highlights, and then we move through exposure, shadow, and we get more and more minimal. Now you can see though, these little triangles, these are showing me the areas that are clipping within the image. Clipping means that we're losing detail in that area. So if I was to actually go and kind of pull this back, you can see that that little triangle on the right now just turned gray. That means we have all of the detail. There's no clipping in those whites or those brights. Now this image should have some brights in it. It was pretty intense that day and it was very cloudy. So because of that, I'm just gonna go and set that back where it was. This little triangle now turned white shows us that we have some clipping within that image. When I hover over the triangle, you can see in the image how it's now turned red in a specific area. That's the area that's clipping. Now if I click on that little triangle, it's going to stay illuminated. So if I'm trying to relieve that area, bring back that detail, I can now get a reference and pull it back until there's detail in those clouds there again. So it gives you a nice visual representation of where that clipping is. Keep in mind though, it's okay to lose detail within an image. As long as you are not affecting your subject and the way that you're pulling your eye through the story, it's okay to lose detail in certain areas, whether that be in the shadows or the highlights. It just comes down to how you're trying to display that to your viewer. Now, as we move through this a little bit more, I'm going to unclick that so we don't see those highlights illuminated anymore. We can do the same thing in the shadow area. You can see the darkest areas under the boats now have a blue area. That's the shadow where it's now clipping in the darks. There's no detail within there. Same kind of thing. There should be some depth in that. There should be some black. So that's okay to see in that area. Now this other image skews to what's known as low key. Low key means that the majority of the image is dark. This was actually taken in a lava tube down in Easter Island, which is just this cave that's now popping out about 100 feet over the sea out of a cliffside. So because of that, it's a really dark area, and it should be because we're literally in a cave. If you look at the histogram here, almost everything is now over towards our shadows and our blacks. There is a little area clipping still in the whites, and that's okay, because now we're looking at the area in front of our subject here, and it's overexposed. It should be overexposed, and that's perfectly fine. So in this case, this is a proper histogram for a low-key shot. This is a proper histogram for a high-key shot. And this is a proper histogram for kind of a mid-exposed shot. There is no proper histogram. It totally comes down to what your image is and how you're supposed to be representing that. So keep that in mind, especially if you're out shooting in the snow. It should be a lot brighter. Now, let's go through and let's actually use the basic panel to edit an image, and we're going to watch that histogram and see how that it's actually being affected as we're pulling detail from certain areas to make sure we're not clipping whether we want to keep shadow detail or highlight detail within that image. So in this case, we've got a raw file that I took up in the north of Norway during one of my workshops that I do for the Aurora. This is a pretty common area. There's a bridge. There's usually going to be about 30 other photographers standing next to you up here, but it's absolutely beautiful. And it's one of the quintessential shots of the Lofoten Island area. You can see that we have a little bit of clipping in the darkest areas underneath, like the houses that are on stilts or maybe in the rocks. But there's a pretty good ability to pull back all that detail if we want to within there. That raw file contains a ton of content that we can then massage out to be able to get the shadows and the highlights exactly where we want them. Now let's start right with the basic panel at the top with white balance. White balance is the color temperature within your shot. This is a raw file, and because of that you can see that there's a number over here that's representing our Kelvin temperature. 5,000 Kelvin tends to be daylight. Depends really on where you're at exactly for the way it's going to look and what time of day. This is sunset and it should be a little warmer because of that. So going to these higher numbers starts to give you a little more warmth within the image. A lower number starts to give you a little more cooling. And then below you can then kind of fine tune the greens or the magentas within the image to get everything looking right. When you're doing any kind of color adjustment, I highly recommend looking away every now and then. Look at maybe out the window, deep into your room to maybe where there's a light turned on, and let your eyes readjust. Our eyes very rapidly change for color temperature adjustments. So as you're staring at this and you're trying to adjust it, turning around, moving your eyes, maybe for about 30 seconds, lets them kind of readjust. It's like you're cleansing your palette, and then you can go back in and you might go, whoa, it was way more magenta than I thought it was. Now I didn't want to do those two adjustments, so I'm going to go and I'm going to reset them. One of the easiest ways to reset is to double click on the thing that you want to do. So if I go to my temperature here, I can double click. It resets it to what the original file had. If I go to tint, I'll show you a different way. We can do it in the arrow area, double click there, and it resets to what the original was. You can see too that it went from white to grayed out, and that grayed out one means it's the original file's settings versus the way that you augmented it when we get into white. The other way we can do this is, let's say when we reset both of these in here, I can go to the heading, which in this case is the WB for white balance, and I can double click there, and it resets everything within that box. Now as we move down a little bit further, we start to get into our tone area, and this is where we're really starting to bring out the lights, the darks, the shadows within the image to shape the way that it looks. So here, if I start with my exposure, this is the way that I generally will do it. I'm going to bring up my subject, which in this case is kind of those houses down there, the water in front of them. I'm looking to make those have the presence that I want them to have. Now by doing so, I'm starting to lose a little of the detail in the sky up here and a little of that impact. So I'm going to go and I'm going to pull my highlights back, pretty considerable amount here, and you're going to start to see some of that color come back in that area. Now it's making this image a bit muddy by pulling back those highlights. You start to see the whites get a little dull, so I'll pop down to my whites over here and pull those up, and I'm watching that histogram. There shouldn't really be anything clipping in here, so I want to make sure that I don't see those clip. So I'm going to keep pulling up here until I'm really starting to fill out that area. And now we're starting to see a lot more pop come into this image. Now I'm going to come back, maybe pull the highlights down a tiny bit more. And then the shadows I'm going to bring up a little bit so that water really starts to pull in some more green, because that shadow detail down there is really where you're seeing a lot of that content fall. Same thing, exposure might pull a tiny bit more up within that range. And as you move one slider, you might notice you have to go back and maybe nudge another one down a little bit. This is kind of the dance that you do back and forth to get this image looking the way you want. Now there's another way you can get guidance on what's under or overexposing, what's clipping in the image. We already went and looked with these little triangles, and we can see kind of where those areas are clipping. There's another way we can do that, and if I go to my whites, this will also work with your blacks, and I'm going to hold down Option on a Mac or Alt on a PC, and then as you start to move that slider, the entire image is going to disappear with the exception of the area that is clipping. So right now, if I move my whites, I can see that's the area with the whites clipping. I can pull that back until I'm not. And same thing, when I get to my highlights, give me that same kind of indication. Now my highlights I can see are doing the job that I want here. Whites I have a little too high. And that gives me a good representation that if, let's say that little blue or red area is hard to see, it's going to let you know exactly where that's happening. Same thing with my shadows. If I go to my blacks, hold down Option or Alt on your PC, those are the areas where I've got true black within my image now. I should have some under those houses. They're on stilts, it's shadowed. I should have some probably under the rocks on the shoreline there, but there's not a lot of areas I want real true black within this image. So that gives me an idea that rather than trying to identify where all those little tiny blue spots are, I can come back down and easily see, okay, that's the area that's clipping or losing detail within that. Personally, I'm fine with that loss of detail there. It doesn't affect the image. Now you notice I have not really moved my contrast at all. I've really been kind of shaping this contrast by bringing up the whites, bringing down those highlights. As you move contrast, watch my histogram. Moving more contrast spreads those blacks and whites one side to the other and tries to separate them more. Going to the negatives in contrast tries to bring those guys tighter together, those brights and darks. So by us manipulating the highlights, the whites, the shadows, we're really doing a lot of contrast adjustment without going in and having to use that slider for the entire image just yet. It might be something we do where we need to bring a little more contrast in, especially like a pre-sunrise or sunrise shot. It's so low contrast then, or just post-sunset, you might need a little bit more bite in that image that, just drawing those blacks and whites up can't achieve. Now contrast and clarity are close cousins to each other. The clarity area is going to kind of be more selective and look to kind of give you a similar adjustment to contrast, but it's going to kind of separate the whites and the brights, the whites and the blacks in a slightly different way. Now, if I pull the contrast up too much, things can really get crispy looking quickly. Personally, I try to stay maybe around 20 or so for that. I find that in a lot of cases, 20 or below is more than enough to get the kind of bite that I'm looking for out of there without getting that overly crispy look. Now, one thing I do see in here that's going to have a big impact on the way this image feels to the viewer, this grass under here was a lot more yellow to my naked eye. So I'm going to go back now that I've started to adjust and manipulate things to my temperature. Bring up that yellow a little bit more so that matches closer to the way the eye was. And that's looking pretty good right there. I don't want to go too far. Get way up there and we start to look a little funky. It might be one of those things though where you do go too far on one side and then you start to come back, and you go a little too far on the other side and you come back, and then you eventually find that middle ground. The other thing I might play with a little bit down here is texture. Texture, also like clarity, is kind of going to give you a little more definition, especially in things like these rocks or these waves crashing up here. And also like clarity, you got to be careful, because if you get up here too high, things can really get crispy looking. So same thing, I try to keep pretty low on this, just enough to get that detail looking the way that I want it within that area in the image. Now this is looking pretty good overall. I might bring back those yellows just a hair. And dehaze we really don't need in this image at all, but similar, if you're in that kind of pre-dawn era where there's very little contrast within that image, that can help pop it up a little bit. But more likely, if you have something with light fog or haze covering that, that's going to help kind of play with contrast and color temperature combined to help eliminate as much of that as possible. Just like our other two though, in this presence area, it's easy to do a little too much with that. Now, I'm liking the way this is looking pretty far, but we're going to go and we're going to increase the color a little bit more on these. Reset that dehaze. Vibrance and saturation, they're also cousins. Vibrance is going to adjust the colors, kind of leaving the warmer tones like our reds and yellows a little more alone, while bringing up the blues and greens to match those more. It's more balancing color within the image. Saturation is going to take all of the color values together and bring them up, including our reds, our oranges, and things like that. Now because of that, because vibrance doesn't really touch those warm tones as much until you really start hitting it hard, that's a better adjustment if you have people in there and you're not going to start getting an orange pallor to their skin tone. It'll keep a more natural look. Saturation, you're going to start to see the orange in the skin come out a lot more, and that's not an appealing look. Trust me. So with vibrance, if we bring up that vibrance all the way here, for instance, you can start to see the blues and those greens in the water are starting to have a little bit more even footing with those yellows and reds on land. Now, I don't want to go up that far. I might pull back a little bit here, because my balance is starting to get a pretty good adjustment there, but I want a little more punch out of it. And that's where saturation is going to come in and help me get just a little bit more. Now, I don't want to go too far up on here. But in some cases, it might be where I want that balance of color to really be a little more on par, but it's getting too intense. So let's just see what happens if we ramp up this vibrance. And now we start to get more of that green and blue popping out in the water versus our yellows and reds on land, and even a little bit of that warmth in the sunset up here. And if we go and now back off the saturation, getting rid of that unnatural, overly saturated look, you can see that water has a lot more presence to the land, but we don't start getting too over unnatural. Now, we're pretty far down on saturation. We're down -10, but we went pretty far up on the vibrance here. That's an interesting balance. I kind of like the way that looks. I bring her back a little bit down and fine-tune that. You bring a little magenta in and see what happens. Warm it up a tiny bit. Now, in the Develop module, if you want to see the way your picture looks before and after, hitting the letter Y is the shortcut to show you a side-by-side of the two pictures. This is going to give me an idea of exactly what it looked like, how I brought things out, and is that something that I like the way it looks at? I do like this right now. Now, I'm going to hit Y because there's another way we can look at that. We can go ahead and hit the backslash above your return, or if you're on a PC, the Enter key. By holding it, pushing and holding, you'll have a before, and then when you let go, there's your after. That's the entire image instead of a side-by-side. If you just tap it, it'll hold that before until you tap it again. So it's just kind of a different reference depending on which way is easier to see. Now, personally, I like the way this image is looking right now. I might bring down that vibrance just a hair more. Bring a little more warmth into it. Get some of the warmth of the sunset hitting. And I think I'm liking that right now. Now, that was the way that I'll generally do an edit, where I'm kind of going from top to bottom, but depending on how your mind works, let me show you the other way. We're just going to flip it around and go from bottom to top. So let me go ahead and reset my image down here. It's going to bring us back to square one. And then I'm going to start now with my blacks. And watch my histogram. I want to bring the blacks to where they're just starting to clip. And this isn't going to take much adjustment in this one, because they're pretty darn close to the edge there. And now I'm going to take my whites up to the level that I would want them at, which is going to be pretty darn close to the top. And now I'm going to bring those shadows up a little bit to try to bring in that foreground. I want to bring those highlights down a little bit in this case. And now bring up that exposure to where I want in the image. Now I'm going to go back and fine tune these, and that's going to be probably in this case bringing those highlights down a bit more, maybe bringing those whites up a bit more, and now bringing those blacks down to get a little more shadow in there. You get a pretty similar result either way depending on what you're thinking in this, but that's the nice thing with Lightroom. If you've got the one way that kind of makes more sense to you, go for it. There's usually about 3 or 4 different ways to approach most things in Lightroom. Now today we are really just using the basic panel to create this image. And the basic panel, along with all of these other ones underneath here, are known as global adjustments. We will dive deeper into these other panels and the global adjustments in later episodes, but in the next episode, we're going to take this image and we're going to start using the masking tool, which is a local adjustment, to start to shape the light in certain areas, and that's going to help draw the viewer's eye around to exactly where we want it. As for today though, that's about it. So from the Lightroom Whisperer, keep on Lightrooming.